well. And social change is not a psychological finding. So the abstract reads that the webinar will provide no easy answers, but does seek to explore the global challenges we face around the climate and ecological emergencies, wider climate justice, and what this means for psychology, community psychology, and the well-intentioned people, hopefully the speaker included, who are trying to make a positive difference. So Dr. Miles Thompson is an associate professor in psychology at UWE Bristol in the UK. He is a clinical psychologist by background with research interests in psychology and its relationship to social, global, and environmental justice. These interests are often approached through the lens of community, critical community, and liberation psychology. So, welcome, Dr. Miles Thomas. We at the Climate, Environmental, and Psychology Division are really happy and excited to have you, and I hand over the session to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be with you here today. As I often do when I prepare for these things, I've put together way too many slides. So I'm going to canter through these, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end to discuss the kind of things I'm thinking about at the moment. And that really is where this talk came from. I certainly do not intend to present to you my amazing research findings and go, look there, here is the answer. In fact, I really plan to do the opposite and kind of go, oh, my research in this area isn't particularly good. And actually, do we all as a whole need to be both carrying on doing the great work that we are doing and also maybe refocus some of our work to ensure that we're doing the fundamental things we need to be doing in terms of climate change at the same time? So hopefully this long-winded title of the talk will start to make a bit more sense as we get through things. But my plan today is to spend a little bit of time, first of all, talking about environmental and climate justice, but just at a very broad level and just in terms of some definitions. And then actually maybe spend a little bit more time than we would normally do thinking about climate change and where we are as a planet at the moment in terms of this existential threat that we face. And the reason for doing that is to then reflect a little bit on this thing called the streetlight effect, which is not a psychological finding, but a metaphor, which may be useful to think about in terms of psychological work. And I've started to think about my own research work in terms of this. And in that respect, I'll then talk a little bit about some of my research in this broad kind of area and how it too falls foul of the streetlight effect. I'll work through these slides. I'll take questions at the end, and I hope we can have a useful discussion at the end. You'll find as I go through these slides, there are quite a few links on them linking to the sources of information. If anyone wants a copy of this slide deck after I'm done, please just email me and I'll happily send them through. But to basically sum up my entire talk, in case you have other things you need to do over the next hour, these are the main points that I'm going to be making, that climate change is here, as are other important related environmental and wider social challenges. We are not tackling climate change or these other important challenges anywhere near fast enough. Tackling these challenges means that we have to confront power. We have to confront power in terms of governments, in terms of businesses, in terms of their interrelationships, and in terms of individuals who value the current status quo. For me, vital issues of climate justice and environmental justice will only get worse the slower we are to tackle climate change and the power dynamics, which are quite happy with the way things are at the moment. Set against that, what I want to do is kind of suggest that maybe sometimes as psychologists in general, and maybe even sometimes as more critical psychologists, we can tend to work where the light is. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that in a little bit. And if that is the case, and I'm not saying it is the case, but if that is the case, then maybe we need to repeatedly check whether our work is as focused as it could be on point 3, tackling power, in order that we can tackle climate change fast enough and reduce the ill effects that are rapidly coming down the track. So just to begin, I just want to put up a couple of slides around environmental and climate justice. I'm pretty sure that all of you on this call are going to know these definitions better than me, but just for the sake of clarity, climate justice is about the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people globally with respect to the decisions we make, the laws we make, the changes we make around the environment. The UN Development Programme in 2022 had a whole report entitled Climate Justice, and in it, it talked about how human action and human inaction have led us to this triple planetary crisis, not just climate change, but also pollution and also nature loss, which is already having direct and severe impacts on a broad range of human rights. And then they list them and get up to and include and even life itself. When we focus in on climate justice, we obviously know and regularly talk about the disproportionate impacts of climate justice, of climate change, and how climate change is going to and is already affecting the poorest and the most marginalized, first of all and worst of all. And how if we move towards climate justice, those who have benefited the most from the industry and the exploitation which has led to climate change must do the most to protect those who are suffering the most now from the ill effects of climate change. Hopefully, this is stuff you all know. This is stuff which is all clear. And I know for many of you on this call, this is stuff you are working on directly to make these voices better heard. Something I've been thinking about more and more over the last few months, and particularly over the summer, is just this point. If we don't tackle the fundamental causes of climate change, if we don't get better at making sure we hold greenhouse gases back as much as we possibly can, the worse that climate change gets, then any quest, any effort, any attention we are trying to bring to bear in terms of environmental justice or climate justice will become more and more challenging. So as well as, of course, involving and raising voices and doing all the amazing work we need to be doing, we also need to be redoubling our efforts to making sure we are tackling climate change at source. And with that in mind, what I want to do is just spend a little bit of time, a few slides, just thinking about climate change itself and kind of where we are as a planet. For me, back in 2018, I kind of had a reawakening. I was working with my undergraduate students who were wanting to do some slightly vanilla psychology projects around individual behavior change, climate change, and psychology. And at this time, the then latest IPCC report came out, and it was an eye-opener to me and it was an eye-opener to them, and they ended up doing very, very different projects. And the kind of statements which came from the IPCC, which made them think, oh, a simple project about recycling or a simple project about flying less isn't going to cut it, were statements like this, which suggested that in order to keep global heating to less than 1.5 degrees, it would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in pretty much every sector of society. And of course, since 2018, those rapid and far-reaching transitions have not happened. Indeed, in a more recent report from the IPCC, their language has got harsher. And this is quite something for the IPCC, which is traditionally quite a conservative body who only make consensus statements. With that in mind, they said this: there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And if the target we hold to is 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial average, then just last year, the BBC, one of the main news organizations in my country, was reporting that we've pretty much passed that on a one-year basis. Actually, in terms of how climate science works, it's not doing it on a one-year basis, it's doing it over an average, over a longer period of time. But researchers in May last year were saying that there was a 2/3 chance that we will pass that threshold between now and 2027. How did we get here? How did our human action and inaction get us here? And it's interesting for me just to touch base a bit with some key dates. Back in 1992 was the first Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. The COP meetings, the Conference of Party meetings, started in 1995 in Berlin. They've been happening yearly since. The 29th, COP29, will be happening in Azerbaijan in November. We're talking about decades of governments and other organizations looking at this, and change is still not happening fast enough. There have been landmark agreements, and they are worth just touching base on. The Kyoto Protocol, which was signed in 1997 and was kind of like monitored from 2008 to 2020, was meant to be a binding agreement. You will do this and you are going to be bound to do this. As a result of that, many countries didn't sign up. The case of Canada is very telling. They did sign up. They realized they weren't going to hit their pledges. And so rather than face a £12 billion fine, they withdrew. It's interesting just to reflect on that. You can sign up to something, you can say that you're going to do it, you're not going to do it, so you're going to have a fine, so you just withdraw from the agreement. After Kyoto came the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is directed in terms of thinking about keeping temperatures to below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees. Because of what happened with the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement is non-binding. It's looser. Countries determine their own contributions. And that in itself is a very interesting thing to think about when you also think about the IPCC talking about this rapidly closing window of opportunity. But actually, for me, you can go back even earlier. And I find this an interesting reference point. Just over 50 years ago, the newly formed Club of Rome published this book, The Limits to Growth. It sold millions of copies around the world. It wasn't focused on climate change, but it was focused on exploitation, and it was focused on confronting, as it says here, the unchallenged paradigm of continuous material growth and the pursuit of endless economic expansion. At the time, it generated a lot of attention. The report suggested alternatives to move to a more sustainable and a more just way of running the economies of the world, but people warned that it would take 50 years to bring these alternatives into action. Of course, we didn't bring those alternatives into action. And what's interesting, there's a YouTube video linked there, and if you watch that video, the video says, for every year we delay, it will make an orderly transition much more difficult. We have delayed, both in terms of challenging the growth paradigm and in terms of climate change. So where does that leave us? In terms of where we are now, we are rapidly hitting, if not already hit, 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial level. In terms of what that means and what has got us there, we are thinking about greenhouse gases. Obviously, in the main, we are talking about carbon dioxide, and of course, everyone knows that. Some of the things which I find quite impactful when I talk to individuals and groups about this is to just remind them how long carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere once we emit it. The carbon dioxide that we're emitting now into the atmosphere is potentially going to stay there for between 300 and 1,000 years. And there are other greenhouse gases too, like methane and nitrous oxide. They are stronger. They have more of an effect and an influence than carbon dioxide, but they last for shorter periods of time. Still a long period of time, but for shorter periods of time. And if we look as a globe, as where we are in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, you can see that certainly in terms of energy and heat and in transport, and apologies if that slide's a bit small on your screens, things are getting a little bit better. There are moves in a positive direction. It is important to then factor in all greenhouse gases, and if you do that, you actually see that the agricultural sector and a term known as fugitive emissions actually start contributing quite a lot of these other greenhouse gases. What does this mean in terms of our progress, in terms of potential temperature rises? Well, our World in Data calculates it a little bit like this, that if we did nothing, if there were no climate policies, then we would be probably heading for temperature rises between 4 and 5 degrees. We do have policies in place that currently mean we're heading for a temperature rise of between 2.5 and 3 degrees. What is interesting is this is different to the pledges and targets that countries have set. If countries kept to that, which it doesn't look like they are at the moment, we'd be looking at something at about 2 degrees, which would be broadly in line with the Paris Agreement. But then when you look at the bottom of that graph, in terms of what would be necessary to achieve 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, and you compare that to our current policies, you realize that we're quite a way off. And some people might rightly say, well, we're doing better than we were. If it's just a little bit more, maybe that's going to be okay. And the bad news that I sometimes have to tell people because they're not aware of this is to let them know about tipping points. So I'm talking to you today from the rather damp and rainy city of Bristol, and just down the road, less than an hour, is the beautiful city of Exeter. And at the University of Exeter, Professor Tim Lenton works, and he really is a global expert in something known as tipping points. And the argument is very simple, and the way he explains it is probably better than the way I would explain it today. But he uses the analogy of a chair, a normal kind of office chair that sits on 4 legs. And when it's got all 4 legs on the ground, it's very stable. But sometimes what we all do as humans is we lean back in the chair, we have 2 legs on the ground, and we're kind of in balance there. And actually, you can be in balance in that position for quite a long time. But if you keep leaning back, suddenly you hit a tipping point and you're not leaning back anymore. You and the chair is on the ground. And Lenton and others argue that the impacts by temperature rises globally are going to be like tipping points. Once we get to various points, we don't just then slowly rise. The impacts rise much bigger. So once we go over certain thresholds, our equivalent chair tips over into a much more serious pattern of ramifications. And actually, anything above 2 degrees seems to make it very, very likely that we start moving into some potentially quite scary tipping points in terms of impacts around the world. Now, it is important to raise this because every time I've heard Tim Lenton speak, he raises this as well. Obviously, when we're talking about those tipping points around temperature rises, that is quite scary. He also says there's the potential for positive tipping points. If we can be doing more in terms of holding power to account, that's not necessarily the way he phrases it, but if we can be doing more in terms of bringing about just transitions, then actually we can accelerate our way to a more sustainable world. Just to make it clear kind of what those kind of tipping points potentially are and how they kind of kick in at different kind of thresholds. At potentially less than 2 degrees, we start making severe impacts into certain ice areas, into certain forest areas. And when those kind of sinks go, the implications are quite severe in terms of the potential futures that we face. So I apologize that in these kind of slides up until now, it's just like, wow, Miles really isn't holding back here. He's not painting a really pleasant picture. And that's very deliberate. I'm very deliberately kind of talking about my understanding of the current climate science from my understanding of what current climate scientists are saying. Because if we care about environmental justice and we care about climate justice, we need to be dealing with climate change. Otherwise, all of our justice work is just going to get harder and harder. And indeed, some people have looked at the current state of our efforts in terms of climate change and they've turned away. So, for example, in the UK, more than 15 years ago now, the deputy editor of The Ecologist, which was an environmental and climate focused kind of magazine, basically got to the point where he thought positive change was impossible, forms of collapse were inevitable, and he formed what was known as Dark Mountain and wrote what is known as the Uncivilization Manifesto. This organization, which I kind of know people in, really appealed to certain artists and creators to kind of darkly imagine what this kind of new future was going to be. Much more recently, Professor Jem Bendel, who was based, I think, at Lancaster University in the UK, did lots of work with the UN, fed into COP kind of publications, saw the speed at which change was happening, and kind of broke with that mainstream consensus and started writing about deep adaptation. More recently, has wrote a book called Breaking Together. But Bendel now really feels that near-term societal collapse is inevitable. And how do we adapt to that reality? Now, I personally don't fully subscribe to this kind of argument. Sometimes people call these people doomers or post-doomers, which I don't think is helpful either. For me, there is always the room to make change. The sooner we make change, the sooner we hold back climate change, the better things are going to be. And even if things are bad, even if we do pass certain tipping points, we can still hold things back further. But recently, I've been following the work of Professor Kevin Anderson a lot. He's based at the Tyndall Centre in Manchester. He's also at Uppsala in Sweden. He is a slow, careful, rigorous climate scientist. But he's starting to call out other climate scientists and saying that if they're not careful, they are becoming part of the problem because they are not saying loudly enough that the world is not doing enough in terms of climate action. He makes these wonderful points about this mismatch between what the science is saying and the level of action that the world and governments and businesses are taking. He makes these really great points, for example, around net zero, which is often how climate change and climate adaptation is kind of talked about. He'll often just ask an audience, what's net zero? And people will come up with their technical answer. And he'll kind of say, net zero means kicking the can down the road. Net zero means making it someone else's responsibility. He kind of argues that actually we don't need net zero, we need absolute zero, and we need it soon, and we aren't moving soon enough. And Anderson is involved with the IPCC. He knows it from the inside, and he provides these fascinating insights into how the different working groups work. His working group on climate science is doing a very good job as far as he says, and I have no reason to doubt him in terms of communicating what science is saying about the dangers that we face. But he talks about another working group 3, which is basically the group which does the economic modeling in terms of how we're going to get out of it. And he says that in some ways, through no fault of their own, their work is bad because it's just based on classical economics. It's just based on standard economic assumptions of the cheapest way of sorting things. And in some ways, the way of sorting things which kind of keeps the status quo as it is. And it's that kind of thing that I think Anderson would argue climate scientists need to be calling out. We're doing our good work over here, but this stuff here, this just isn't moving us fast enough. And of course, that maybe chimes with that progress chart I showed you earlier. We are here, we need to be here. If we don't get closer to here, the tipping points we face are very problematic. So there, I've just spent a bit of time kind of going, this is what climate science is currently telling us. And now I want to kind of segue a little bit into what this streetlight effect is and how it might relate to psychology. So the streetlight effect is a kind of a Western, a global North version of a story which is kind of like popular in Muslim cultures. There is a character known as Nasreddin, who is kind of known as a wise old fool. And in the global North, we sometimes talk about the Aesop fables, and this is kind of an equivalent. But the streetlight story is essentially this, that one night a policeman sees someone searching for something under a streetlight and asks them what they've lost. They say they've lost their keys, and so they both spend a bit of time looking under the streetlight together. After a few minutes of searching, the policeman asks the person, are they sure that they lost the keys here? And the person says, oh no, I lost the keys over there, but the light is better here. Chomsky, talking about science generally, said, science is a bit like the joke about the person who is looking under a lamppost for a key that they have lost on the other side of the street, because that's where the light is. And what Chomsky says about science is it has no other choice. And just recently, I've started to wonder about psychology and psychology and its relationship to the streetlight effect, particularly in terms of its work with climate change, environmental justice, and climate justice. And I love psychology, and in many ways, I forgive psychology a lot, particularly when I look at where psychology started from. And of course, there are different stories about where psychology started from, and psychology evolves differently in different parts of the world. But if you look at a very Western-centric view of where psychology started, and you think, for example, about someone like William James, and you think about his 2-volume work of The Principles of Psychology in 1890, the scope of psychology, the first chapter, starts with these words, that psychology is the science of mental life. That is all psychology is, the science of mental life. It's about the brain. It's about minds. It's about, looking at the other chapters, it's about thought. It's about memory. It's about sensation. It's about perception. It might also be about hypnotism. Notice that in that original text, there's nothing even remotely social. Psychology as first defined, is very much, as James says, the science of mental life alone. And it's interesting just to remember that that's where psychology starts. Now, of course, psychology today, more than 100 years on, is doing very, very different things and is doing a lot of research in terms of climate change and in terms of climate justice. In terms of mainstream psychology, much of the research that is being done arguably is very individual. It focuses on the psychological factors that may or may not impact sustainable or unsustainable behavior. You see, for example, in the mainstream psychological literature, new concepts being developed. For example, at the moment, there is interest around the idea of psychological distance as being a potential bar to more sustainable or unsustainable behavior. Part of me wonders if this in itself is psychology doing a bit of a streetlight effect. Psychology is very individually focused. Psychology started as the science only of mental life. I just wonder if there's a conflict, a missed opportunity between what I was talking about in those first slides and where we are in terms of climate change and climate science and the kind of research that psychology is doing at the moment. And even when psychology is talking about individual sustainable behavior, what individual sustainable behavior is it talking about? So just last year, Scientists for Social Responsibility published what they felt were useful guidelines in terms of what people in the global north should be adhering to in terms of lifestyle if they wanted to keep their behavior to 1.5 degrees compatible living. And it's important and scary just to look at it for a second. It basically means no flights. It basically means no car ownership, though you might be able to carpool. It means vegan or vegetarian diet. It means massive retrofitting of homes. It means maybe smaller homes. It even has implications in terms of pets and pet ownership, certainly no large animals and maybe vegan diets for cats and dogs. It even raises very, very interesting questions about whether we consider having children or not. Now, again, I'm not saying that I fully buy into this. I'm not saying that I entirely agree with everything that is being said here. But when people kind of say, this is what we need people to be doing in order that we can live up to the 1.5 degree commitment that we might need in terms of avoiding tipping points, is that the kind of behavior that is being explored in terms of psychological research that is going on? And is there any single psychological concept that has the power to move us towards making these things more likely to happen? Much as I love psychology and I love psychological work, there's a little bit of me which would doubt that. Just very briefly, I'm a clinical psychologist by background, and as I would expect, there is great, good, rigorous work going on in terms of looking at the potential implications of climate change and the knock-on effects it's going to have on mental health. And this is great and good work to be doing. But again, there is a bit of me which kind of asks, is this a streetlight effect? Is this us looking at where the light is as opposed to maybe where society has lost its keys? We are not making the changes that we need to be making in terms of climate change. Is it likely that telling our leaders, or at least telling our academic audiences, that climate change is going to make people's mental health work likely to be the thing that changes our leaders' behavior in terms of taking more action? In my country at the moment, according to the latest data, not only is mental health getting worse, but life expectancy is actually falling in certain regions. So is a future promise of worse mental health going to be the nudge we need to move people forward? I'm not sure. What I am never doing and what I never want to do is criticize these people for doing the great work they're doing. You'll see in a minute, I will be particularly harsh on my work as well. But it makes me wonder. It makes me kind of wonder whether we should be doing more. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. There is also a thing that sometimes we do in psychology where we take things and we individualize them, and we take things and we potentially professionalize them. Understandably, when facing the realization that climate change is coming and the realization that previous generations haven't done anywhere near enough, many of our young people experience eco-anxiety. For me, as a psychologist and as a clinical psychologist, we have choices in terms of what we do with that. We can measure that, we can pathologize that, we can come up with individual treatments for that, or we can understand exactly why and what those people are saying, and we can move them towards action and get them to move us towards action, the action that we have not been taking for decades. In a similar way, there's a wonderful thing, a wonderful person-led grass-up movement called Climate Cafes, which is about bringing people together to talk about things like climate anxiety. It's a great thing. It's a wonderful thing. And yet, psychology, as it sometimes does, gets involved in interesting ways. And currently in my country, you can now do some professional training in order that you become a bit more certified in running climate cafes. And it's like, yeah, that is work we can do, but is that the work we really want to be doing? And moving aside from mainstream psychology, we of course have the more critical and community psychologies who criticize mainstream psychologists for looking at individuals in isolation, for focusing in on mental constructs. We instead want to look more at context. We want to be more participatory. We want to be more political in our work. And yet, in that work, I'm just going to skip that slide due to time. In that work, it's definitely argued that we have been slow in turning our attention to the climate and ecological emergencies. But that does not mean that amazing work is not being done now, particularly in community psychology in this area. I just want to highlight a parallel development to this. So in Germany, where they have a group called Psychologists for Futures, they've recently published a new book called Critical Environmental Psychology. And it's interesting because the whole idea behind the book is that mainstream environmental psychology is not really doing the business in terms of climate change, and things need to be more critical. And they invited me and my co-authors, Brendan Barnes and Maria Fernandez Jesus, to write a chapter just talking about community psychology and its work in this area, so that hopefully they could learn as they set off in their more critical environmental psychology journey in terms of potentially not making some of the mistakes that mainstream psychology and even community psychology has made. But what we do in that chapter is we highlight some of the excellent work that is being done by various community psychologists around the world in terms of climate change and in terms of climate justice. And I'm aware that some of those people may even be on this call, but if you're not aware of these people's work, please check them out. They do amazing work. Just ask for a copy from the slides from me, and it will click through to their institution's homepages. And what I want to do now, just in the last 10 minutes or so of this talk, is just to talk a little bit about some of my work. And I am not talking about my work in terms of this is the answer. I very much do not think my work is the answer. Indeed, I think my work falls foul of the streetlight effect. I'm doing this thing over here because this is where the light is. This is where I have some skills, and this is where I have some ability to do stuff. But I think actually the place I need to be doing the work is over here. But I just want to highlight 3 studies of mine. One which looks at the kind of broad reach of environmental and wider social challenges. One which then follows on from that and looks at who is responsible for tackling these challenges. And a third, which is looking at participated generated examples of social change. The first one of those studies is already out. That one's published. Study 2 and 3 are in various forms of publication or revision at the moment. In this first study, what I wanted to do was gather participant-generated data on the range of both environmental and wider social challenges. And for me, I've long held this hunch that climate change is often thought about in isolation. It's thought about as this standalone problem, and potentially a standalone problem that can be techno-fixed. Some technology that we don't have yet is going to come into action in the future, which will allow us to continue business as usual. I've always held that climate change is a similar thing to the other environmental destructions, habitat loss, pollutions that humankind wreaks upon itself, and if thought about in that way, needs to be addressed in similar kind of ways. Also, being somewhat curious about what mainstream psychology sometimes does. Mainstream psychology often kind of says, oh, why aren't people looking at climate change individually? Maybe there's a psychological reason for that. I tend to think a lot of people aren't looking at climate change individually because their governments aren't telling them to look at it individually. And also, many people and communities in my country, and even more so around the world, are facing even more pressing challenges, which are much more in their face day to day. And I just wanted to see whether two different participant groups, academics in the UK and young people in the UK, what their thoughts were about environmental and wider social challenges. And so the questions that they were asked were, what are the major challenges faced by environments, ecosystems, and natural resources in the world today? And in terms of wider social challenges, what are the major challenges faced by individuals, communities, and wider populations in the Western world today? And they generated material, and then we basically consolidated that material in the results. And just to very quickly summarize what was going on in those results, in terms of environmental challenges, my kind of hunch going into this study was supported that yes, obviously climate change dominated in terms of the most pressing environmental challenge. It was mentioned by more people than anyone else, but also there are these wider ecological emergencies in terms of biodiversity loss, in terms of forms of pollution, in terms of various other exploitations. What was interesting when we compared the two groups is that, kind of understandably, academics had a more in-depth and more nuanced understanding about what was going on. Academics also talked about things that young people didn't talk about. For example, they talked about more the role of consumerism and the role of capitalism. When thinking about the wider social challenges, and for the academics, this was a different group of people, climate change and environmental loss also dominated. This is not only an environmental challenge, it's also the wider social challenge, but also what came up with these other challenges as well. Poverty, intolerance, issues related to public health, the impact of technology, lots of other kind of potential issues. What was also interesting is that there were large gaps between what academics came up with and what young people came up with. And again, in the wider social challenges list, these also related to things like austerity, inequality, and capitalism. Again, present in academics' mind, less present in young people's minds. It's like, my hunches here were kind of supported. Yes, we can think about climate change in isolation, but maybe it's helpful to think about it as part of this broader ecological emergency. One environmental challenge, which was actually mentioned mainly by academics, which we didn't expect to happen, was wider human challenges preventing a more environmental focus. What is interesting, as I've gone out and talked to more people about this work, people have been saying to me, oh, are you aware of planetary boundary science? And are you aware of the polycrisis? And I kind of go, oh, no, not aware of that. What should I be aware of? And it's basically other people talking about these things in a similar kind of way. So planetary boundary science, which was interestingly first presented to the Club of Rome, the same people who came up with the Limits to Growth report, they basically now talk about these 9 different planetary boundaries, of which only one is climate change, which we have to be careful in terms of exceeding. And just this week in The Guardian, there is a report that we may now have exceeded our boundaries of 7 of these 9 PBSs. Some people also talk more widely than just environmental stuff alone and talk about a polycrisis. They talk about this interlocking and overlapping set of challenges that we face, which we need to kind of resolve as a whole in order to move forward as a society. And I would tend to agree. Though what is interesting about the polycrisis is different people define the polycrisis in different ways. Just very quickly, study 2 went out to a different population with the same challenges that were generated in study 1 and said, who's responsible for tackling these challenges? People were asked to rate the level of responsibility for both individuals, businesses, and governments. And it was really interesting to see what data people came back with. On average, people feel that individuals do have a considerable degree of responsibility, but businesses have more and governments have the most of all. So it's interesting for us to think about when we think about psychology and we think about the work we can tend to do. If ordinary members of the public are saying businesses and government are even more responsible for this than individuals, where are we putting our work and effort? Is it interesting that often we put our work and effort into individual level focused work? Maybe that individual level focused work should be directed into getting individuals to hold businesses and governments to account. And of course, if we're going to hold our businesses and governments to account, and if we're going to bring about the level of change that we need in order to hold back the temperature rises that we are already experiencing, we're going to need social change. We're going to need to bring about social change, and quickly. Now, I wish I could say this last piece of research is me kind of coming up with chapter and verse about how we bring about social change. But it isn't. It's me doing a streetlight effect. It's me going, well, I don't quite know how to do that in a paper, but I can ask people about social change, and maybe we can get more of an idea about what social change is, and that maybe will help us think about social changes in the future. And as a community psychologist, it was interesting because in terms of community psychology, we often talk about social change, but we often talk about it in quite a broad way, maybe a not particularly well-defined way, or defined in such a broad way that it doesn't necessarily lead us forward. So what we did in this piece of work is we generated participant-generated examples of social change. We went out and we asked people, what do you think are concrete examples of social change from the past 200 years? We did that with one sample of people, and then with the next sample of people, we asked participants to kind of go, people have come up with these examples. Do you think these are significant examples of social change? And if so, do you think they are positive, neutral, or negative? Participants came up with 52 different statements, which were mentioned, I think, at least 8 or 10 times. And obviously, I don't have the time to go through each of those with you. But it's interesting to see the themes that people came up with. There's a theme of social change, which I think in many ways is classical social change around legal protection rights and equality, fighting for different kinds of justices in terms of sexual rights, gender equality, racial equality. But there's also other social change themes, for example, around technological impacts. You can think about changes made in terms of transport, and also a lot of people made reference to changes in terms of information technology. Then there's social change around global and domestic political events and government. So here we have global changes, global events, for example, from the election of Obama or the election of Trump to world wars and acts of terrorism. And then there's a fourth theme around social beliefs and behaviors, which talks about things which are happening at much more social and community level. When we got this different sample of people to rate them, it was interesting to see what was rated significantly and what was rated positively, negatively, and neutrally. Interestingly, all 52 social change examples were rated as being a significant example of social change. What was fascinating for me is that the social change example that was rated as being least significant, still significant, but least significant, was the rise of current models of capitalism, such as neoliberalism. But if you just look at this table at the bottom, you can see how the significance ratings and also the valence ratings, positive, negative, or neutral, changes across the four themes. What this is interesting in terms of communicating to me, though bear in mind my caveat about this falling foul of the streetlight effect, is that these are all examples of social change. Social change is not always positive. Social change is happening all around us. And we desperately need to get better at influencing positive social change now because of all the challenges we face, not just in terms of climate change, but the other challenges that have been highlighted in these studies. Just another personal reflection. One of the reasons I did this study is I was kind of going, what are people going to mention? And are they going to tell me stuff that I don't know about where I can go, oh, that's very similar to what we need to do now in terms of the social changes we need to bring about in terms of climate change. And I have to be honest, when I look at the list of 52, I struggle to kind of go, oh, yes, if we just do that now, that's going to be exactly the same, and we will be able to turn back the tide in terms of climate change. But turn back the tide we must. Throughout these 3 studies, I've noticed this kind of theme, this mention of capitalism, of neoliberalism, of profit, of economic expansion, but also the potential that people are not seeing this as being one of, if not the roots to so many of the crises that we see around us. Just to put that into context in terms of climate change, it is well argued that just 100 fossil fuel companies contribute 71% of carbon emissions. These are either investor-owned or state-owned entities. Now, you can rightly argue that those figures include not just extraction, but also downstream consumption. But you can also wonder aloud whether notions of profit feature largely in these difficulties that we have. And to hold those things to account, we need to develop more social change, but social change in all likelihood through resistance, through activism, through campaigning. And so we think about the campaigns we've had, previously, going back to the March on Washington, the Seattle activism, but some people say riots. We think about Occupy. In the UK, a lot of our climate activism is currently focused around 2 organizations, around Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. Extinction Rebellion had a lot of positive influence to begin with. It easily got the government to declare a climate emergency. It even got the government to host citizens' assemblies where groups of the public come together, hear the arguments, and say, on the basis of this, I think these are the decisions that need to be taken. The difficulty is getting the government to take those decisions. Organizations now hold climate assemblies, but a bit like the Paris Agreement, it's non-binding. It becomes performative. How do we get action taken at the level we need action taken in order that change can happen? And so that leads back to where I began. Climate change is here. We are not tackling it fast enough. Tackling it at all means confronting power. Climate justice and our efforts towards climate justice are only going to get harder if we don't tackle climate change itself. Is our work as psychology doing everything it could be in terms of confronting power in order that we tackle climate change, in order that we make this world as livable and as sustainable as it can be for everyone? I'm sorry, I've gone on a bit longer than I wanted to, but I hope we still have a couple of moments for questions. Thank you so much for listening to my talk today. If in any way you want to engage with any of the stuff I've been talking about, I really would welcome comments now and further conversations later. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for such a wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. And I agree with you about the streetlight effect. I think that is why you're demonstrating there's a major gap in psychology that we need to actually be dealing with. So yeah, thank you everybody for putting your comments in the chat box, introducing who you are. We have quite a variety of people from across South Africa and many other places. We would, as Miles has indicated, please, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and ask it verbally, or you can put the questions in the chat box. Okay, some comments. Wonderful talk. Thank you, Miles. Yeah. Any other questions?
What I will just do is I'll just drop my my email in the chat box. So if anyone's got any questions that they don't want to follow up with me now, they may have other things they have to go on and do, but they want to chase up on things later, please just email me. If you want a copy of the slides, if there's a point that you kind of agreed with, or if there's a point you disagreed with, please get in contact. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to open up further kind of conversation of this. If you want copies of the slides, just drop me an email and I'm very happy to share them.
I think that maybe for people in psychology, they might be a bit shocked at the statement about us being and using the streetlight effect in terms of pathologizing people. And I think this pathologization is something that's becoming much more apparent with people trying to explore the extent to which how many people are experiencing anxiety and the types of anxiety people are experiencing. So I just think that that type of research, though, will provide really useful information. I'm not so sure it's going to make a big difference in terms of the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase and the tipping point that you were speaking about.
And this is the challenge, you know, and you're right. And so then the question is, what do we do? You know, do we just keep doing what we've always done? And potentially there's merit in keeping doing what we've done before. But if we are facing these challenges, and if 1.5 and maybe even 2 degrees are getting away from us and we care about this, shouldn't we be putting all our efforts into kind of going, okay, there's important work to be being done there, but even more important work to be being done there? And I'm not saying that's easy, and I'm not saying that that's straightforward. And of course, it's not just the responsibility of psychology. It's the responsibility of all disciplines and all engaged citizens. But it's something I've been thinking about and have been provoking myself with. And so I thought it might be useful to share and see what other people think. I saw somebody raised a hand.
Malhas, Dr. AJ Malhas, you can go ahead.
Oh, fine, I'm covered. Thank you so much.
Okay, so there was something else I was thinking. You know, you're an academic in the UK, and there are some academics here on the chat and in the room. And I was just thinking, to what extent do we set up students to be able to think more critically, to actually think about the social and other effects of climate change, and to link climate change to the many other justices and injustices people are experiencing? So maybe we to blame in academia as well for producing students that are not quite critical and can be more critical and can actually ask the questions that they need to ask because they're the future. So what do you think?
Absolutely. I completely agree. You know, our students are the future, and it's interesting. Let me just talk just very quickly from the UK experience. I recently published some very different work, which started off from a very traditional mental health place and was kind of asking, why are more and more students seemingly suffering from mental health difficulties in university settings? But instead of answering it in a traditional clinical psychology way, we went after it in a much more of a community psychology way, and looked at things in a much more contextual angle. And we looked back and asked, people from other educational sectors why they think students are struggling much more now. And the contextual reasons were quite telling, that students in this country are now very much kind of trained to focus on the assessment. They're trained to put knowledge into their heads and then get that knowledge out of their heads in exams and assessment. They're trained to focus on what the next assessment point is going to be. That then makes it difficult when they arrive in a university environment, where actually university environments still tend to encourage kind of like independent thought and independent thinking. But what you were talking about is that ability to genuinely be critical, to genuinely kind of like reflect on the role of subjects and how they're involved in these wider social issues. If you've been schooled in education to date to just focus on the assessment and just jump through the hoop, and often maybe just to do that in order that you can secure the better job at the end of things, then it is perhaps the case that maybe accidentally students are at risk of becoming somewhat less critical. Now, on the one hand, I say that, but also on the other hand, I'm very lucky that I get to teach students a final year module called Psychology and Social Justice, which looks at all different kinds of justice: social, global, environmental, climate, and the potential role and drawback of psychology in this. And they really do report having their eyes open to things that they hadn't previously been aware of in terms of the potential complicity of psychology, but also the potential of psychology to do differently in the future.
Okay, so we have one common question. Thank you, Miles, for the wonderful presentation. What do you think is the role of people in the global south, Africa in particular, on the climate justice issue?
The first thing I would say in response to that is, even though I can offer an opinion, there are much, much better people than me who can answer that. So Brendan, who made a nice comment about my talk earlier, would be in a much, much better position to answer that. But I think what I would say in terms of not just South Africa, but all countries around the world, what we need to be doing as psychologists and as citizens is we need to be holding power to account, however we can do that, and joining with other people and organizations who are holding power to account, so we can bring together the global level of pressure that we need in order to make governments and international organizations make the level of difference that they need to be making. Now, one thing that I would say, and Brendan's work on this is just brilliant, is that, of course, people in South Africa and in other parts of the world may find it less easy to raise their heads above the parapet and push for change in the level that I can in this country. And that is understood. But for all of us, what I feel we need to do is be holding power to account at the level we can, to the extent that we can, where we find ourselves, but making sure that we are making connections at scale so that this is making the difference it needs to be making urgently around the world. And just to put that in context, I don't know if you on this call kind of like followed the ramifications of the last COP meeting, but essentially the last COP meeting was dominated by lobbyists. One of the reasons that governments are not taking the level of action that they need to is that businesses, corporations, lobbyists are pushing back strongly. If organized people are not doing at least the equivalent and putting that pressure onto the governments, then they will talk change. But as long as they only talk change instead of enact change, we are going to move more worryingly towards tipping points. How does that sound to you as a possible response? Thank you for the thumbs up.
Okay, so it's 21 minutes past 5. I think we can wrap up in the next minute or so. If there are any burning questions that anybody would like to ask or engage Miles with, please feel free to do so. As I said, there's no right or wrong question, and I think what is important is for us to remember that this is a problem that's affecting everybody in various ways. South Africa, we've had floods in so many different ways. We've had the ocean with the spring tides just to reclaim its land. We've had now snow and people being stuck in the snow. And South Africa, we don't really have snow, so Miles, forgive us. We South African, we love the sun. Snow is not very common here. So we've had droughts. So these are major things happening in our country, and we're a community, maybe not all a psychological community, but we need to be coming at this together. So please feel free to ask any questions. I think we can wrap up in the next minute.
Just in case people are typing final things, just this week in the UK, we've experienced unprecedented kind of floods, and in Central Europe this week, I think dozens of people have died in countries like Poland because of flash flooding. That's why it's important to kind of say, climate change isn't this future thing. Climate change is here now. It is killing people now. It will only get worse unless we take the action that we haven't been taken. But as you say, that's why it's just important to get these messages out and to join up as citizens around the world to hold power to account.
So with that, any final remarks you would like to make, Miles?
I would just like to thank you all so much for taking this time out of your day, for attending and listening to what hopefully it said in the blurb that you looked at, which wasn't necessarily going to be the most positive talk, but which was hopefully going to give a realistic account of where I think we are and where I think psychology is. Not to say that we need to throw psychology away, and not to say in any way that I think we need to give up hope, but we need to redouble our efforts to turn psychology and turn our activism and attention towards making the changes that we need so we can have a more just world in so many ways.
Definitely. So from myself and the Climate and Environmental Psychology Division, we'd like to say thank you, Miles, and to all the people that attended the meeting and the webinar today. It was lovely. You're the 5th presenter this year, and I think as the CEPD, we've really given it our all to address the theme for the year, which was climate change and climate justice. And Miles, you really did justice to the topic, so thank you so much. Yeah, so with that, we will be putting the webinar onto our CEPD CISO YouTube channel. We have 2 comments. Thanks, Fatima, for organizing such an informative session. It's my pleasure. Yeah, I do it for the research division as well. So hopefully someone else can take this over after I'm done. And then we have a comment. I'm hopeful because people are now realizing the urgency to address climate change. And I like that more than talking. It's a time to act and hold people in power accountable. Thank you, Yvonne, for that lovely comment. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and have a lovely rest of your evening. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.